Senator Rice.
Thank you, Chair.
ACCC. So, Mr Sims, I'm interested in some questions about toll road concessions and competition issues. I note your press release from a few weeks ago where you raised preliminary competition concerns about Sydney Transport Partners' proposed acquisition of a majority interest in the WestConnex project, with Sydney Transport Projects being majority owned by Transurban. Could you summarise your concerns about the Sydney Transport Partners' proposed acquisition of WestConnex?
Yeah, we've got two broad concerns. One is that, WestConnex is quite a big road, and the two concerns are, well, three probably, but the ability to be better, that if an alternative road provider got hold of the our own WestConnex, they'd be better placed to bid for new roads, and that issue took on extra significance because we've seen that recently Transurban over the last 30 years has been successful with self-initiated road programs, where it's gone to a road authority in a number of cities and said, what about we build this road, and there's some perhaps trade-off with other roads they've got. So owning roads gives you a stronger position to self-initiate bids. So if WestConnex was owned by somebody else, there'd be someone other than Transurban able to go to the New South Wales government with self-initiated bids. That's one issue. And the second issue is that in the particular case of WestConnex, it can compete with other roads in the Sydney network that are also tolled. And so you could, with an alternative owner of WestConnex, you could find different owners of toll roads that in fact can both get you to the same destination. So those were our preliminary concerns. The statement of issues is a statement of preliminary concerns, and we're now seeking to just take those forward, get market feedback, do a bit of our own modelling to work out how substantial those concerns are before we make our final decision. When do we make? In July?
July 19th.
July 19th.
Right, okay, so quite a way off. Have you got a position as yet in general, I mean, going particularly to the point about unsolicited proposals and the strength that gives Transurban in particular, in exchange for toll extensions on existing tollways?
Well, look, it's something that's happening more recently. So I think when we've looked at toll road bids before, that wasn't an issue uppermost in our minds. But now that it is happening a lot more, it certainly says to us that road users and taxpayers perhaps would be better off, but particularly road users would be better off if there were more than one entity able to make those bids and put those proposals forward to government. So exactly how big an issue that is what we'll be working on between now and mid-July. So it's certainly uppermost in our mind. We're trying now to work out how important it is. And
are you only going to be looking at the WestConnex issue in this, with your statement of issues, or are you going to be looking more broadly? I mean, I'm particularly interested in Transurban and their unsolicited proposal of the Westgate Tunnel in Melbourne, where we've got, the analysis being that, where have I got it here? They're seeking, or they're getting, a 12-year concession extension from 2035 to 2047. It's going to generate $20 billion to $30 billion in nominal extra toll revenue, and compared to the cost of the Westgate Tunnel, which according to most estimates is going to cost $6.7 billion to build, and with the Transurban contribution expected to be approximately $4 billion. So they're getting a pretty good deal for it, and they're in a position where they're able to offer something very substantial to the Victorian government. Yeah,
well, I think that's an illustration of the concern we've got, but the context of our decision-making is this is a merger decision or an acquisition decision because Transurban is seeking to acquire WestConnex. So the way our process works, our law says it's against the law to have a merger or acquisition which has the effect or likely effect of substantially lessening competition. So the tradition has been that companies come to us before completing a project or an acquisition to see whether we think it could have the effect or likely effect of substantially lessening competition, and we say either no, it's not a problem, or yes, it's a problem. And ultimately they're looking for us to form a view about if they were to proceed, would we seek to oppose them in court? That's the question we're wrestling with, and it's purely in relation to Transurban's acquisition of WestConnex, or the Transurban Consortium's acquisition of WestConnex. So no, we're not looking at that proposal as an issue in itself, but we are taking account of that sort of thing in forming our view about how large our competition concerns are in relation to the consortium, the Transurban Consortium's acquisition of WestConnex. So it really is, the decision making is all about that. All about that.
So, I mean, more broadly, do you see that there may be a need for you to look at the issue of unsolicited proposals, where, like in a market like the Melbourne Toll Road market, where you've only got essentially one major operator, Transurban, and those unsolicited proposals end up increasing their power and lessening competition?
I'll see whether my colleague Mr Betsy or indeed Jean Pratt has a view. I think it's hard that it would fit under our Act. And of course, keep in mind the state government is really the decision maker here. So you would think that it's their job to assess whether any bid is in the interests of the drivers in their state and, of course, their own revenue and road planning. So I think really the decision maker is them. I'm not sure how it would breach the Act. Do you have any?
Look, it's hard to speculate on the basis of a hypothetical. These things are usually regarded as planning decisions and brought within the scope of a state government planning or infrastructure development power. And I don't really want to comment particularly on the Westgate proposal or any specific proposal, but our experience is that if a very large amount of money is being spent, they will arrange for the necessary approvals and exemptions from our Act, which they're in a position often, usually, almost always, to give.
The state government, that is.
The state government.
So they are able to
bring a
have
proposal.
exemptions
Section
from your
exactly.
Act that says they can take actions that are excluded from our Act.
And frankly, bankers and other financiers are very unlikely to invest in a project where there is not absolute certainty about these sorts of issues.
But I should just add, though, and correct me if I'm wrong, Marcus, that in many ways the situation you're describing, it's unlikely to be a breach. If it were likely, so I think the dominant view is it's unlikely to be. If the circumstances presented themselves where it could be, they can they can remove that risk through an exemption under our Act.
I didn't want to imply that there was a likelihood.
I think on its
breach.
face of what you're describing, I'm not sure it would breach our Act, because our Act is basically all about, on the consumer side, is someone getting misled. On the competition side, has something happened which substantially lessens competition? Now, that's always a tricky estimate. So I think going back to WestConnex, that making sure there's a couple of players that could provide those bids is a competition question. Once somebody's in that position, taking advantage of that position, I doubt whether that would be a breach of the Act.
Right. I mean, you note in your statement of interest with regards to the WestConnex that that the ACCC is consider whether the New South Wales government is sufficiently likely to constrain Transurban to exercise such ability, such that competition concerns are not likely to arise.
Yes.
But I mean, because you're not looking at the unsolicited bid in the Westgate Tunnel, do you have any ability to, have those concerns with regard to, whether the Victorian government, in fact, are going to take competition concerns adequately seriously into account?
Look, I doubt we've got any power to do that. The WestConnex issue is one where some would argue, and possibly the lawyers representing Transurban might argue, that because the state government controls what unsolicited bids they accept, that's enough of a safeguard to make sure nothing that could be an unfortunate outcome would occur. And I guess we were really saying in that we're not sure you can rely on that, because it could well be that the state government might feel that it gets more money in or spends less money to achieve an outcome that may not be in the interests of the consumers. So we're not sure that in our competition assessment we can rely on the state government to completely look after the competition concerns we've got. So that's what we were saying there, and that's therefore why we're not going to put an undue weight on that issue in this assessment for WestConnex. But that doesn't mean, I don't really think we have a legitimate way into assessing the Westgate matter.
So even though, what I see in Westgate is, in fact, you've got perverse incentives for the government to use that model, so it's got a budget neutral investment, and it passes on the cost to customers who basically, you've got essentially a monopoly toll road provider, and in fact, the cost of that new investment are passed on to road users who are using a completely different asset. But despite that, you don't think there's any way in for you into that?
No, Senator, and the reason, often people see our Act and say, well, if there's any chance someone might do something that might harm consumers, in this case drivers, that it must fit under the Act. That's actually not the way it works. The way it works is you have to show that there's been someone being misled, you have to show there's a cartel, you have to show there's something that excludes competition. It is quite precise as to it has to be a particular action rather than us being on the corner waiting for something that could lead to higher prices for consumers. That's an outcome, but there's got to be an anti-competitive step along the way.
And I would add that if the exclusion of competition is as a deliberate result of government policy, then it's very difficult for us to take action because of the various exemptions in our law. A good example of that is the arrangement that has been put in place in Melbourne for transport between the city and the airport. So that's a monopoly that's been given in return for an agreement not to put competing public transport services in. Public policy decision made by the government excludes competition from public transport. There's no room for us to get involved in that. We can complain about it, we can say it's anti-competitive, but from a legislative point of view, there's no room for us to
So
take
how do
action.
state governments apply for exemptions? What's the process that occurs?
Well, it doesn't apply, it's judge and jury, Senator. It just does it.
It just says we are exempted.
They've got to pass
as part of their legislation.
Well, they've got to pass a law
Yeah.
that then slots them into our Act. So it's something they can do, and there's nothing. They're in complete control of their ability to do that.
They've got to be transparent about it
That's
and
right.
upfront about it.
But it doesn't require any approval from us, and doesn't
Okay,
apply any approval
they
from
just
the Commonwealth.
legislate to say that they've got exemptions.
That's
full
right.
stop. And finally, I'm just wondering, do you see that this area, in addition to the work that you're currently doing on WestConnex, this area of looking at sort of toll monopolies and toll roads more generally, is it an area that you think that you will end up doing more work in?
In the immediate term, Senator, I doubt, because we've just got so many other things that we've got to look at. I do keep saying we're quite a modest-sized organisation and we have a lot to do, so I'd be reluctant to add to that list. We're really flat out with all the enforcement cases we've got on, and freeing up people to do that at the cost of other things, I don't think we will in the short term. I understand the problem. It'd be nice to be able to look at such things.
People are concerned about it for sure.
Yes. There's a range of things we could look at and start advocating on, but I'm afraid the list is pretty full at the moment, I'm
Great.
sorry.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr Sims. Thanks, Chair.